On a quiet Atlanta night, a routine traffic stop turns into a dramatic clash when Officer Greg Thompson, driven by prejudice, wrongly arrests Terrence Johnson, a well-dressed black man in a luxury car. What Thompson doesn't realize is that Terrence is a powerful businessman. As the truth comes out, Thompson's career and life face imminent jeopardy. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell to avoid missing any videos. Do you think you can get away with this? The harsh, grating voice of the white police officer, laced with palpable contempt, rang out like a dire pronouncement as he shoved the black man forcefully against the hood of the luxury car. The metallic clang of the impact reverberated through the street, starkly contrasting with the eerie stillness of an ordinary Atlanta night. There he stood, a well-dressed black man at the wheel of a high-end vehicle, a sight that, for many, would have been entirely unremarkable. Yet for this officer, it was an insult. In his skewed perception, such a man had no right to be in command of such a car. The luxury and power symbolized by the vehicle were far beyond what the officer believed someone like him should possess. Without bothering with the formality of questioning or verifying documentation, the officer had already decided to hands up now. The command, delivered with a sharp edge, cut through the empty street, drawing a few curious glances from passers-by. Yet no one dared to intervene. The officer's hand rested menacingly on his holster, poised for any hint of resistance. "This car is stolen, isn't it? I bet you don't even know who the rightful owner is," the officer sneered, his tone dripping with self-assured malice. The black man, despite his impressive composure, knew that reasoning with the officer was futile. The prejudice and disdain in the officer's gaze made it clear that his presence and possessions were grounds enough for suspicion. "You're making a big mistake," the man managed to assert, striving to preserve his dignity in the face of the injustice. The officer's response was a harsh, cynical laugh, the kind that betrayed a perverse pleasure in exercising authority, in belittling someone to assert dominance. "The mistake was thinking you could drive around in a car like that without being questioned. You don't belong here. People like you don't have things like this. Who do you think you are?" The officer's words oozed with humiliation, reflecting his belief that the man's very existence was a transgression. The black man was fully aware that he had committed no crime, yet for the officer that was irrelevant. This was about control, about showcasing who held the power. Without a hint of hesitation, the officer slapped handcuffs on him and threw him into the back of the police car, ignoring the man's protests. "I'm the owner of this car. I can prove it. You're committing an abuse of power," but the officer's ego, inflated by racism and arrogance, was impervious to reason. To him, a black man in a luxury vehicle was an anomaly, a threat, something illicit. As the officer drove toward the precinct, he barely concealed his smug satisfaction. He relished the thought of having once again asserted his authority, of having put someone in their place. What he could never fathom, what was entirely beyond his grasp, was that the man he had just arrested was far from an ordinary criminal. The officer's contempt and arrogance had blinded him to the true identity of his captive. Upon reaching the police station, the other officers glanced curiously at the handcuffed man. Despite the degrading situation, he maintained a composed demeanor that struck them as unusual. There was something about his calm, unflappable presence that unsettled them. Why was he not desperate or pleading like so many others in his predicament? The tension escalated when the senior officer arrived and immediately pulled the arresting officer aside. "Do you have any idea who you've brought in?" The superior's voice was stern and urgent, filled with gravity the arresting officer didn't initially comprehend. "What? Just another guy, probably some drug dealer or car thief," the officer replied dismissively, still convinced of his righteousness. The superior's gaze hardened as he studied the officer, his voice low and intense. "This is not just another guy. This man owns a significant portion of the city. And now, because of your actions, you've set in motion a chain of events that is going to cause a lot of trouble. Very serious trouble." The weight of the senior officer's words hit the arresting officer like a ton of bricks. The adrenaline and fear surged within him as the reality of his mistake began to sink in. Like this, he stammered, his bravado evaporating. He now faced the grim realization that what had seemed like a simple act of humiliation was on the brink of becoming a catastrophic blunder. The man whom he had wronged, disrespected, humiliated, and treated with blatant disregard as if he were no more than a common criminal held a power that was beyond anything the officer could have ever imagined. The millionaire he had unjustly arrested, without a shred of evidence or any plausible justification, now possessed the very authority that could dictate the officer's fate. And now the question that looms large is, what transpires when power shifts from one hand to another? when the victim of discrimination and injustice becomes the most influential figure in the community, and the one who once wielded power recklessly now finds himself on the receiving end of fear and anxiety. What happens next? The police officer, who had until that moment viewed himself as the supreme authority with absolute control over the situation, begins to grasp the precariousness of his position. He realizes that his entire life, his career, his reputation, and everything he had painstakingly built now teeters on the brink of collapse. Despite the growing realization of his imminent downfall, the officer attempts to maintain a facade of composure, concealing the fear that gnaws at him. Deep inside, however, he is acutely aware that his time may be running out. Will he find a way to extricate himself from this predicament? Or will the man he so callously wronged demonstrate that true power is not determined by the color of one's skin, but by intelligence, resilience, and the ability to reverse the situation? Only time will reveal the outcome of this unfolding drama. Are you prepared to witness what happens when a powerful black man chooses to fight back against a system that sought to dismantle him? Atlanta, a city emblematic of contrasts, stands as a paradox. It is a place where progress, innovation, and wealth coexist with a persistent undercurrent of prejudice and the lingering scars of a racially divided past. Within this intricate tapestry, Terrence Johnson had meticulously constructed his empire. As a black man who defied the odds, he rose from a modest upbringing in the city's south to establish himself as one of the region's most successful businessmen. Terrence's holdings were extensive, a vast array of properties, businesses, and stocks scattered across the state. His achievements were undeniable. Yet to many, including some of his white counterparts, he was seen as an anomaly. He appeared to have shattered the unspoken rules that dictated who was destined to thrive and who was meant to be held back. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Terrence was not merely wealthy, he was influential. He understood the significance of his success in a world that often seemed determined to impede the progress of men like him. His journey was marked by numerous obstacles, from his early days selling lemonade in a struggling neighborhood to negotiating with investors who underestimated him solely based on the color of his skin. Despite these challenges, Terrence emerged victorious. His triumph was not marked by arrogance or ostentation, but by a serene dignity that disarmed those who sought to undermine him. For Terrence, success transcended financial gain. It was a testament to the potential of black men to surpass expectations and achieve greatness. Nevertheless, Terrence was a man who preferred to keep a low profile. He was not one for seeking media attention or attending high-profile events. Instead, he chose to enjoy the quiet joys of life with his wife Camille and their 2 children, Trey and Jasmine, in their peaceful suburban home, away from the glare of public scrutiny. Camille, a distinguished lawyer in her own right, was not just his spouse but his staunch ally. Together, they represented an ideal of success, love, and mutual respect, a model of what many aspire to achieve. Yet that night, everything was poised for a dramatic shift. Terrence was on his way home from a successful business dinner, where he had secured a significant contract for the expansion of one of his real estate ventures. The prospects for the future seemed bright, but little did he know that his life was about to take an unforeseen turn. He was cruising through the night in his luxury car, a sleek and polished vehicle that drew envious glances from passers-by. To many, it symbolized success, wealth, and achievement. But for Officer Greg Thompson, it represented something far darker, an embodiment of perceived threat and danger. For Thompson, a 45-year-old white man with deep roots in Atlanta's police force, a black man behind the wheel of such an expensive car was a disturbing anomaly. To him, it was a scenario that fits into a preconceived narrative of danger and wrongdoing, a belief he carried with him that night. Greg Thompson's prejudices were not simply born from personal experiences but were a product of his upbringing. Raised in a conservative household where notions of race and class were rigidly defined and passed down through generations, he was steeped in biases that had subtly shaped his worldview. Although he saw himself as a staunch defender of the law, committed to maintaining order, his sense of justice was often tainted by these ingrained prejudices. He did not consider himself racist. Instead, he believed he was upholding the law against those he deemed a threat to societal norms. However, his judgment was consistently clouded by a distorted perception of who constituted a threat. When Officer Thompson saw Terrence driving through a neighborhood where he believed people like Terrence had no business being, he acted on impulse. Without pausing to question the rationale behind his actions or the absurdity of the situation, he flipped on the emergency lights and signaled for Terrence to pull over. Taryn, though caught off guard, was far from intimidated. He had long learned that even when he was in the right, he was often treated with suspicion and hostility. This was a scenario he had encountered before, and experience had taught him to stay calm. He maneuvered the car to the side of the street, took a deep breath, and prepared himself for what was to come. As Officer Thompson approached the vehicle, his demeanor was stern and unyielding. Driver's license and registration, he demanded curtly, barely making eye contact with Taryn. Taryn handed over the documents quietly, sensing an underlying tension in the officer's tone. There was an unmistakable aura of hostility that made the encounter feel more like an interrogation than a routine traffic stop. The officer's gaze was not that of someone merely performing his duty, but rather that of someone who had already formed a judgment. "Is this your car?" Greg asked, barely glancing at the papers in his hands. Taryn, maintaining his composure, replied, "Yes, it's registered in my name. You can verify it in the documents." The officer took a cursory look at the paperwork, but his visible discomfort was evident. He struggled to reconcile the image of the well-dressed, calm man with the idea of owning such a high-end vehicle. This incongruity unsettled him deeply. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Greg inquired, his tone indicating that he was not particularly interested in a real answer. Taryn responded carefully, "Not exactly. I was adhering to the speed limit and didn't violate any traffic laws." Greg's irritation grew as he scrutinized Taryn's composed response. He was unaccustomed to seeing someone like Taryn exude such confidence and self-assuredness without fear. This defiance fueled his frustration, and he resolved that a mere traffic stop would not suffice. He was determined to escalate the situation. "Step out of the car," Greg ordered abruptly. Taryn hesitated for a brief moment, fully aware that the demand was unwarranted. He recognized the potential danger of resisting, but also understood that compliance was crucial for his safety. With a resigned sigh, he exited the vehicle, raising his hands to signal his non-threatening intent. Greg proceeded to search with unnecessary aggression, the stillness of the night bearing silent witness to yet another instance of unwarranted abuse. "You have no right to treat me this way," Taryn said, struggling to keep his composure while his anger began to surface. Greg, however, had already made up his mind. For him, it was no longer about enforcing the law, but about asserting dominance. Without further explanation, he slapped handcuffs on Taryn and forcefully pressed him against the police car, disregarding his protests. This was no longer a matter of justice, but an exhibition of power. As the cold metal of the handcuffs tightened around his wrists, Taryn felt a surge of indignation and outrage. He was acutely aware of the injustice being inflicted upon him, not for any actual wrongdoing, but for who he was. At that moment, the raw sting of humiliation settled deep within him, but so did a resolve. He knew that he would not submit to this abuse. He vowed to hold Officer Thompson accountable for every moment of suffering he had inflicted. And so the stage was set for a night that would unfold into a drama far beyond its initial scope. The events of that evening, marked by a blatant abuse of power, would soon evolve into a significant incident, one that Greg Thompson, in all his arrogance and presumption, could never have foreseen. Never have foreseen. What began as a stark display of authority was destined to culminate in consequences that would stretch far beyond the simple act of slapping on handcuffs. The police vehicle roared through the streets of Atlanta, slicing through the silence of the night with the sharp, unrelenting sound of its siren. Taryn, confined in the back seat, peered out at the cityscape he knew so intimately. Yet tonight, the familiar skyline seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. His handcuffed wrists, a glaring symbol of the injustice he was enduring, caught the faint glow of the streetlights. Despite the intense anger seething within him, his face remained a mask of controlled calm. He understood that this was no time to lose his composure. Every word, every gesture could be twisted against him, and the last thing he wanted was to give Officer Greg Thompson any reason to escalate the situation further. The oppressive silence of the vehicle was eventually broken by Taryn's voice. "You didn't tell me what I'm being charged with," he said, his tone low but resolute. Officer Greg Thompson, with his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, maintained a deliberate silence for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with the same condescending arrogance that had marked their earlier interactions. "You don't need a specific violation when you're already a problem. You know that?" Taryn took a deep breath, his indignation swelling with every word spoken by the officer. He had encountered discrimination before, but this was an entirely different level and abuse of power combined with public humiliation that felt deeply personal. Greg Thompson's behavior seemed to be driven by a perverse pleasure in subjugating someone like him. "I'm a problem, is that it?" Just because I'm driving a car that you deem inappropriate. Taryn's voice, though controlled, carried an edge of rising fury. Men like you, Greg began, then faltered briefly, his voice wavering before he resumed with renewed firmness. You always think you can buy whatever you want. You believe you can be anywhere, do anything you please, but someone needs to enforce limits. Taryn's lips curled into a bitter smile. This wasn't the first time he had encountered such attitudes. The notion that his success as a black man was an affront to certain individuals. He had always known that, for many, his achievements were an uncomfortable anomaly, and tonight, it seemed, he was being put in his place simply for the crime of existing and thriving. I grew up in this city, Taryn said slowly, each word carefully chosen. Everything you see here, the car, the properties you're likely aware of, everything was achieved through hard work. I didn't steal anything, I didn't wrong anyone. But what about you? What do you possess beyond that gun and badge that makes you feel so significant? If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Taryn's words struck Greg with the force of a physical blow. The officer's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to maintain control. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone like Taryn. The very idea that a black man could confront him with such authority and confidence unsettled Greg profoundly. Be quiet. You'll have plenty of time to talk once we get to the station, Greg snapped, trying to cut off the conversation. However, his voice lacked its previous conviction, betraying his discomfort. Taryn, on the other hand, understood that the night was far from over. The injustice he was suffering was palpable, but he was fully aware that this was merely the beginning of a much larger confrontation. When the squad car finally arrived at the police station, Greg exited swiftly and, with an unnecessary show of brutality, yanked Taryn out of the vehicle, shoving him roughly toward the imposing metal doors. As they made their way through the lobby, the few officers present observed with a mix of curiosity and restrained disapproval. It was as though they were used to Greg's aggressive behavior. Yet tonight there was something different in their gazes, a blend of surprise and discomfort. Perhaps they recognized Taryn, or maybe they realized that Greg had overstepped his bounds. Do you think your money will shield you from this? Let's see who you are without your credit card and connections, Greg taunted, a sneer distorting his face as he led Taryn to a makeshift cell. We'll see how you fare behind bars. The metallic clang of the cell door closing behind him echoed through the cold, sterile environment, and Taryn felt the crushing weight of humiliation settle over him. Greg walked away, a false sense of triumph radiating from him, convinced he had won another small victory. But Taryn, seated on the cold bench of the cell, understood that this was just the beginning of a far more significant battle. As the hours dragged on, the clock on the wall seemed to move at a crawl, each tick echoing the slow passage of time. The once quiet police station, nearly deserted when Taryn first arrived, was gradually filling with the bustling activity typical of an early morning shift. Outside, the sun was making its ascent, casting a golden hue across the city. Yet within the confines of the cell, the darkness seemed to stretch on endlessly for Taryn. Despite his access to resources and influential connections, the persistent gloom and the sensation of being trapped weighed heavily on him. He knew that once his lawyers were summoned, the flimsy facade of this situation would begin to crumble. However, no amount of legal expertise could erase the sting of humiliation, the sense of being unjustly targeted, merely for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, fueled a smoldering resentment. The monotony was finally disrupted when the officer assigned to the morning shift approached, clutching a steaming cup of coffee and wearing an expression of exhaustion. The officer's approach marked a shift in the atmosphere, and a faint whisper of change was in the air. "You're Taryn Johnson, aren't you?" the officer asked, his voice trembling slightly as he glanced nervously toward the sergeant's office. Taryn's response was silent, his gaze fixed intently on the officer. He observed with a keen eye as the officer's unease grew, noticing the direction of his furtive glances. It was clear that something significant was unfolding. The shrill ring of the police station phone cut through the quiet, a sound that signaled an unexpected development. Greg Thompson, the officer who had been so confident just hours earlier, was abruptly summoned by the sergeant. The urgency of the situation was palpable as Greg, with a look of bewilderment, entered the sergeant's office, leaving the door slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, indistinct murmurs of the conversation reached Taryn. The sergeant's tone was unmistakably dry and edged with irritation. "Thompson, you messed up this time," the sergeant's voice reverberated through the door, carrying an undercurrent of anger. Greg's attempt to defend himself was lost amid the rising tension and the sergeant's growing exasperation. It was clear to all that Greg had lost control of the situation. The sergeant, with a stern expression, placed a stack of documents on the table, turning them towards Greg. "Do you have any idea who Terrence Johnson is? Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? This man isn't just any businessman. His connections and influence extend far beyond what you can comprehend." Terrence, positioned outside the room, could only catch fragments of the conversation, but he sensed the turning point was near. His patience and strategic approach were paying off. His legal team was mobilized and en route, ready to confront the officers and dismantle Greg Thompson's credibility. Inside the office, Greg shifted uneasily in his chair, his previous air of confidence having dissipated. The sergeant's words were relentless. "Do you think you can simply walk away from this? I've just had a call from City Hall. The mayor himself is involved now. They expect you to come in and explain your actions. This isn't going to be resolved with a mere reprimand." Greg's frustration boiled over as he shot up from his seat. "I was just doing my job." The vehicle in question was suspicious. "I acted on the standard procedure." The sergeant's piercing gaze silenced Greg's defense. "Standard procedure? Or is it your prejudice driving your actions? This isn't the first time you've found yourself in hot water, Thompson, but in this case, this one is too significant. Johnson is a major real estate investor with extensive political and media connections. You mistook him for an ordinary suspect, but you've just gone after one of the city's most powerful figures." Greg, now fully grasping the weight of his misjudgment, sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the inevitability of the consequences. His actions, driven by deeper biases and darker impulses, had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. Meanwhile, outside the cell, the commotion in the police station intensified as Terrence's lawyer arrived, clad in a sharp suit and exuding an aura of unwavering determination. The lawyer swiftly moved through the station. His demeanor was resolute as he engaged with the officers, demanding Terrence's immediate release. The pressure was mounting, and the longer Terrence remained confined, the greater the repercussions for the Atlanta Police Department. Meanwhile, within the confines of the sergeant's office, Greg found himself desperately trying to convince the sergeant that everything was a mere misunderstanding, that he had been following standard protocol along. His pleas fell on deaf ears as he realized the gravity of his situation. He could feel the piercing scrutiny of the sergeant's gaze, knowing that each word he spoke was being meticulously recorded and could potentially be used against him. The sergeant, visibly weary and frustrated, shook his head slowly, signaling his disapproval and resignation. "Greg," the sergeant said, his voice laden with tired resignation, "you've dug yourself into quite a mess. This time, no amount of excuses or apologies will extricate you from this predicament." At that very moment, Terrence's lawyer entered the scene with an air of undeniable authority. With a practiced and commanding presence, he approached the cell door and unlocked it with a confident click. "Mr. Johnson, let's not waste any more time. The arrangements have been made. You're free to go." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Terrence, exuding an aura of calm and composure, rose from his seat and walked with deliberate strides through the narrow corridor. Every step he took was under the vigilant gaze of the police officers scattered around. Some officers averted their eyes, their faces a mix of discomfort and embarrassment over the unfolding situation. Others gazed at Terrence with a blend of curiosity and grudging respect, recognizing that he was a man of influence and power far beyond their reach. Greg, still confined within the sergeant's office, observed the unfolding drama through the narrow crack in the door. He could sense that the moment of reckoning was drawing near. As Terrence exited the station in silence, his presence seemed to cast a palpable weight over the entire room. The media, already camped outside, erupted into a frenzy of camera flashes and reporters clamoring for details, their questions lost in the chaos of flashing lights and buzzing activity. The police station door closed behind Terrence with a finality that reverberated through Greg's very being. The sound felt like the metaphorical collapse of the ground beneath his feet. He understood with a sinking feeling that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The control he once held over figures like Terrence was slipping away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, now the one under scrutiny, now the one facing judgment. As Terrence's car pulled away, Greg remained within the police station, paralyzed not by physical restraints but by the paralyzing fear of the unknown consequences that awaited him. He knew that Terrence would not let this transgression pass without significant repercussions. The reality of his impending downfall began to set in, and Greg braced himself for the inevitable unraveling of his life as he had known it. The sun had climbed higher in the sky by the time Greg was summoned to an urgent meeting with the mayor. The atmosphere at City Hall was charged with tension, and Greg found it increasingly difficult to focus as he took his place in the chair opposite the mayor's imposing desk. The mayor, a figure of stern authority with a deeply frustrated expression, wasted no time in addressing the situation. "Thompson," the mayor began, his voice carrying a weight of exasperation that seemed to consume Greg entirely. "Do you have any comprehension of the magnitude of your actions?" The mayor's words cut through the room with a sharpness that left Greg reeling. He stammered a few disjointed defenses about fulfilling his duties, but the mayor, clearly uninterested in excuses, cut him off with a decisive tone, signaling the beginning of what was bound to be a grueling confrontation. "Your job," the mayor's incredulity was unmistakable, reverberating through his voice with a sharpness that cut through the room. "You dared to arrest one of the most influential men in this city without any justifiable cause, acting on nothing but your own biases and prejudices. This egregious overreach is going to have dire consequences for the city. Johnson has already filed $1 million lawsuit against the department, and you, Greg Thompson, will be the public face of this scandalous escalation." Greg's efforts to steady his breath were futile as he grappled with the crushing weight of the impending fallout. The mayor's words were delivered with a chilling precision, each syllable underscoring the gravity of the situation. Greg's options had evaporated. There was no avenue left for retreat. The relentless march of reality was growing increasingly harsh and unforgiving. "But I was adhering to the protocol," Greg attempted to argue, his voice strained with desperation. The mayor's stony expression remained unchanged, offering no solace. "Protocol," the mayor scoffed, brandishing a folder overflowing with documents that chronicled the details of the case. "You acted with evident prejudice, Thompson. This is clear to anyone who examines the evidence, and now we are poised to pay a steep price not just financially, but in terms of public trust. The repercussions of this case will ripple through the city." The silence that followed was thick and oppressive, amplifying Greg's growing sense of dread. Terrence Johnson was not merely a wealthy individual. He was a significant figure whose status imbued him with symbolic power. The events of that night, orchestrated by Greg, would not be easily forgotten or forgiven. The mayor rose from his seat, walked to the window, and gazed out at the sprawling city below. "You're suspended," Greg, the mayor declared with a finality that left no room for negotiation. "And I can't say whether you'll ever wear that uniform again." The mayor's words struck me with unyielding certainty. Greg understood that his fate had been irrevocably sealed. There was no possibility of reversal. As he exited the room, he felt the weight of every gaze in the hallway. Once a respected officer, he was now a cautionary tale, the embodiment of the consequences of abusing authority. Outside City Hall, Terrence was deeply engrossed in meetings with his lawyers and the press. They were aware that the legal battle would be formidable, but the advantage was squarely on their side. Terrence, maintaining his usual composed demeanor, was prepared to watch as Greg's career disintegrated. The legal proceedings accelerated rapidly, and the case captured headlines across both local and national newspapers. Greg Thompson's name became synonymous with allegations of racism and the abuse of power. His once promising career unraveled swiftly, each day marking a deeper descent. As Greg left City Hall, every step seemed heavier under the oppressive morning heat, which felt more intense than usual, a reflection of the crushing pressure now resting on his shoulders. The uniform he had worn with pride for years now felt like a burden, dragging him down into a pit of disillusionment. The actions of that night had shattered his sense of identity, challenging everything he had previously stood for. Beyond the loss of his job, he faced the disintegration of his self-worth and authority, leaving him adrift and powerless. News of his suspension spread rapidly across the city, igniting a frenzy of media coverage. Initially neutral, the press began to revel in the exposure of yet another instance of abuse of power, a glaring example of an institution in dire need of reform. Greg watched the unfolding drama from the confines of his home, his name repeatedly splashed across screens and headlines, painted as a corrupt and racist police officer. The transformation had been dramatic. Terrence Johnson, once a figure of humiliation and restraint behind bars, had emerged as the dominant force. He had not only regained his freedom, but had also commandeered the narrative. Terrence's strategy, devoid of loud proclamations or aggressive tactics, had relied on his strategic acumen, influence, and legal expertise to dismantle the police officer who had overstepped his bounds. The moral dilemma loomed large over the unfolding narrative, casting a long shadow over every character involved. Greg, despite his colossal error in judgment, was a man who fundamentally believed he had acted with integrity. His perspective, though undeniably tainted by ingrained prejudices, was a reflection of the broader, flawed system that had shaped him. This system perpetuated inequities, embedding them deeply within societal structures. Now, as Greg faced the harsh glare of public scrutiny and humiliation, he found himself grappling not only with the immediate fallout of his actions, but with a profound existential crisis about his entire life and values. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Meanwhile, Terrence was ensnared in his ethical conundrum. The legal proceedings he had initiated against Greg in the police department were advancing with remarkable speed. His legal team had assured him of a favorable outcome, given the mounting pressure on the city and the media's aggressive stance. As he looked out from his office window, overlooking the sprawling Atlanta skyline, Terrence reflected on the ramifications of his actions. He was convinced that justice would be served, but he was increasingly aware of the delicate balance between justice and vengeance. Terrence had always envisioned a justice system capable of rectifying wrongs and holding even the most powerful accountable. Yet now, with the opportunity to irreversibly alter Greg Thompson's life, he questioned the extent to which it was justifiable to pursue such a course. The potential to destroy Greg's career weighed heavily on him, prompting a deep introspection about the moral boundaries of justice. His reverie was interrupted by the entrance of his lawyer, who brought with him a report on the current status of the case. Mr. Johnson, the media is firmly in our corner. The city is under significant pressure and Thompson's career as a police officer is effectively over. We may be able to negotiate a settlement soon, but the press will be looking for your stance. Do you wish to continue pursuing the action to ensure Thompson's permanent exclusion from the force, or are you open to negotiating a deal? Terrence's gaze fixed on the lawyer, his mind wrestling with the weight of the decision before him. He understood that his choice was not merely about Greg Thompson, it was a reflection of his values and the kind of justice he wanted to uphold. While he acknowledged the necessity of holding Greg accountable, he also saw a broader opportunity to set a precedent for the city and the community, demonstrating that true justice does not need to be vindictive or excessively harsh. I need to think this through, Terrence responded, his voice steady yet laden with contemplation. The lawyer nodded in understanding and departed, leaving Terrence alone with his thoughts. The forthcoming decision was pivotal, with the city watching closely, the media clamoring for resolution, and Greg Thompson grappling with the devastating consequences of his actions. At home, Greg was enveloped in a personal abyss of despair. He withdrew from public life, plagued by the fear of judgment and scorn. His wife, Sarah, struggled to maintain a semblance of calm, though the strain was evident. Their children, who had once idolized him, now viewed him with a blend of confusion and dismay. The life Greg had meticulously constructed was disintegrating, and he felt powerless to halt the collapse. Yet amid this turmoil, a transformation was beginning to take root within Greg. For the first time in years, he was compelled to confront the stark reality of his actions. Sleepless nights were spent replaying every decision, every biased thought, and every prejudice that had shaped his behavior. The public disgrace forced him to question his own identity and morality. More than just the fear of losing everything, Greg faced a deeper, more profound question. Was it too late for him to change? The dilemma was intricate and painful. Greg recognized that his prejudices were deeply ingrained, products of a corrupt system. But he also saw a faint glimmer of hope for redemption. The real challenge lay in whether he was willing to confront his inner demons and seek genuine transformation. As the city held its breath in anticipation of the court's decision, the internal conflicts between Greg and Terrence deepened with each passing day. For Greg Thompson, the trial presented a moment of profound self-reflection and a chance to confront the consequences of his actions. The weight of his choices pressed heavily on him, offering an opportunity to seek redemption and perhaps atone for his mistakes. For Terrence Johnson, the court case was more than a personal victory, it was a platform to effectuate real change. He sought to use his influence not to seek vengeance, but to drive meaningful reform and highlight the systemic issues that had enabled injustice. The moral dilemma for both men grew more intense as the final hearing approached. How far were they each willing to go to find redemption? Could the principles of law and justice be sufficient to transform a man's heart, or would something more profound be necessary? The day of the final hearing arrived, casting a spotlight on a case that had come to symbolize a broader struggle against prejudice and systemic failure. The courthouse was teeming with journalists, community members, and observers, all eager to witness the resolution of a case that had captured the public's imagination. On one side stood Taron Johnson, a businessman who had become a symbol of resistance against systemic racism. On the other side was Greg Thompson, a police officer whose actions had led him to a precipice of disgrace. Greg, seated beside his lawyer, appeared visibly broken. The toll of weeks of intense scrutiny and public humiliation had etched deep lines of weariness and regret on his face. He understood the gravity of the situation, the potential loss of his career, his reputation, and the personal reflection that had exposed his failings. For the first time in a long while, Greg confronted a mirror that revealed his flaws, his missteps, and the prejudiced beliefs he had clung to. The realization that his arrogance had come at a steep price was a bitter pill to swallow. Across the courtroom, Taron Johnson maintained the resolute demeanor that had guided him throughout the ordeal. His focus was not on seeking retribution, but on ensuring that the underlying issues of prejudice and abuse were addressed. His goal was to hold accountable those who perpetuated injustice and to advocate for systemic changes that would prevent such occurrences in the future. As the trial concluded and the final arguments were presented by both sides, the direction of the verdict seemed increasingly evident. The judge, with an air of gravitas, addressed the court with a voice that commanded attention. The case of Taron Johnson versus the Atlanta Police Department and Officer Greg Thompson stands as a landmark case, not only for our city but for the nation, the judge declared firmly. What has transpired here is a stark demonstration of abuse of power, systemic racism, and the urgent necessity for reform. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as the judge continued. Officer Thompson's actions were unacceptable and will not be tolerated. As a consequence, the department will face a substantial financial penalty. Furthermore, Officer Thompson will be suspended from his duties and his police license will be permanently revoked. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom, signifying a momentous decision that would resonate far beyond the immediate aftermath of the trial. For Greg Thompson, the verdict marked the end of a chapter that had irrevocably altered the course of his life. For Taron Johnson, it represented a crucial step toward addressing systemic flaws and advocating for justice. As the court proceedings concluded, the city watched closely, hopeful that this landmark case would catalyze genuine change and a testament to the enduring pursuit of justice. The judge's pronouncement fell heavily upon Greg, a final, resounding blow that seemed to shatter the foundations of his life. He lowered his head, a deep sense of defeat enveloping him. The reality of his situation was undeniable. His career, his livelihood, and everything he had painstakingly built over the years were now in ruins. Yet amidst the wreckage, Greg experienced an unexpected flicker of relief. For the first time, he wasn't grappling with the harshness of reality. He accepted the verdict with an almost peaceful resignation, acknowledging the weight of its implications. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Taron, standing poised and composed, was a stark contrast. He met Greg's gaze for a brief, charged moment. Though no words were exchanged, there was a palpable sense of closure between them. To Taron, the court's decision symbolized more than a personal triumph. It signified the dismantling of a long-standing cycle of abuse, prejudice, and injustice. His victory was not merely a legal one, but a moral and ethical breakthrough. Taron had harnessed his power not to humiliate or annihilate, but to initiate correction and reform. As Taron exited the courtroom, the throng of reporters and the flashing cameras created a cacophony of media frenzy. Amidst this chaotic scene, he made a succinct yet profound statement. Today is not just a victory for me. It is a victory for everyone who has, at some point, been wronged. Justice may be a slow and arduous process, but it must be pursued with integrity, without hatred, but with firm resolve. Greg, in contrast, left the courtroom in solitary silence. The swagger and arrogance that once characterized his demeanor had evaporated, replaced by the sobering realization that his life had irrevocably changed. The journey ahead would involve rebuilding from a place he had never anticipated finding himself. The burden of his mistakes would remain a constant companion, yet within his quiet contemplation, a nascent hope began to take shape. There was now a dawning awareness of what needed to be done, and a flicker of hope that perhaps, through redemption, he could forge a new path. In the months that followed, Taron channeled his energy and resources into meaningful change. With a portion of the compensation from the lawsuit, he established a fund dedicated to combating systemic racism. His focus extended beyond the realm of policing to address pervasive inequalities in various sectors of society. Taron recognized that the struggle for justice was far from over, but he was determined to lead this charge with purpose and conviction. His legacy transcended his business achievements and financial success. Terrence Johnson emerged as a symbol of resistance, embodying the peaceful pursuit of justice and demonstrating how power, when wielded with integrity, can effectuate profound and positive change, even in the face of deep-seated temptations for revenge. As we come to the end of this video, let's take a moment to reflect on the journey we've shared. We've explored a range of profound and impactful topics, from the struggles and triumphs of individuals facing prejudice and injustice to the powerful messages of spiritual encouragement and personal growth. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What have you learned from the content we've covered? How has it resonated with you or inspired you? Take a moment to think about one key takeaway or lesson that you'll bring into your own life. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm eager to know how these insights are making a difference for you. If you enjoyed this video and found it meaningful, please let us know by leaving a comment, giving us a thumbs up, and sharing it with others who might benefit from it. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay updated with our latest content. Your support not only encourages us but also helps us reach more people with these important messages. Thank you for being part of this community. Your engagement and feedback are invaluable. I'm looking forward to reading your comments and continuing this journey together.